Special guest here. His name is Akash Chaguli, and he is American with Americans for Prosperity, and he is the National Policy Director. Let me tell you how this came down. I got in touch with the folks at AFP this week. They were kind enough to work out the issue surrounding a congressional debate that's took place in Utah this week, and worked out a format so that Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians, in certainly a kumbaya moment, could share a stage and exchange ideas for the benefit of the electorate. To which I give the folks at AFP a hearty thank you, because it's that type of open platform that encourages the exchange of ideas and really serves as a benefit to our real customer, and of course, that's the American taxpayer. So welcome to the coalition. You're a Rhode Island guy. You're just here in town. You happen to be in town to meet with family. No ulterior motive?
That's exactly right. I had a lot of friends ask if I was in town for the NGA, and the answer was absolutely not. Don't get a lot of time to get home in the summer. Rhode Island in the summer is obviously a lot more pleasant than Washington, D.C. in the summer. Unfortunately, don't have great beach weather today, but was fortunate enough to get hooked up with you and happy to join.
Great. Thank you for coming in on such short notice. Now, you're a native of East Greenwich.
Yep.
And the East Greenwich school systems.
Yep.
Which, as we all know, enjoyed some controversy this week, but we're not going there.
You can if you want.
Local school, I am blessed for a number of reasons, none of which were my own quote-unquote fault. My children were able to attend private schools, and by the way, the quality of the East Greenwich school system and the Barrington school systems in general, in North Kingstown, are private school level, and therein I think lies some of the challenges, because the budgetary times are stated to hit even towns like EG. But I've managed to avoid public school systems now for my entire adult life, because if you've ever seen one of those awful YouTube videos where the guy, the clearly frustrated, angry parent launches himself across the table to tackle guy behind the podium, I would be that guy. just tell you. So it's good for everybody, I think, that I didn't have to engage with the fine folks at the Cumberland school system. But tell us about your educational background and what you did here in Rhode Island before you headed off to D.C.
Yeah, absolutely. So born and raised in East Greenwich. My parents have been here for, I think, 35 years. Moved to East Greenwich for the schools, went through public schools, kindergarten through 12th grade at East Greenwich. Graduated from East Greenwich High School in 2012. Like you said, had a great experience there. I know one of the things I work on now is education policy, and unfortunately, not all school systems can be like the one that I went to. So educational choice, educational freedom is an issue I'm very passionate about. But from East Greenwich High School, went to Boston College, just up the road from here. Graduated from Boston College in 2012 with a degree in political science. Wanted to get into conservative politics, libertarian politics. Didn't quite feel like I was ready to move to D.C. Obviously, not a ton of opportunity here in Rhode Island. I was working a little while for Dawson Hodgson, who was the state senator from East Greenwich.
I should tell you, Dawson Hodgson was actually one of the first guests ever in the history of the show.
That's great.
An outstanding human being. Truly one of the bright lights in Rhode Island government at the time. And as I like to say, Rhode Island, Dawson Hodgson, where are you? Rhode Island cries its lonely eyes for you. Because he, as a I'll call it a libertarian Republican, and I don't use those words very often, but as a state senator, Dawson Hodgson was intimately involved in the passage of marriage equality here in the state, showing his libertarian stripes, but at the same time was fiscally conservative. And if I could just interject one more thing, I think everybody in the listening audience or anywhere would agree at this point in history, in Rhode Island history, that if Dawson Hodgson had been elected Attorney General, this would be a very, very different place to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it actually speaks to his character, that Rhode Island wasn't quite ready for somebody like Dawson Hodgson, given what the electorate has looked like here.
Right.
But from working for him, went on to work for the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity, right, which most of the folks listening to you might have heard of. But it's a small free market think tank here in the state, part of a much larger national network. All 50 states have a small state think tank like that, and we like to think of ourselves, or they like to think of themselves, almost as baby heritage foundations, baby Cato institutes, if
Right.
you will, focused specifically on state level policy. So really an uphill battle for them, but they continue to do great work. Mike Stenhouse, Justin Katz, and the rest of them. I was working for them for almost a year and a half as outreach coordinator, and then felt like it was time to move on to bigger things. Applied for a job on the policy team at Americans for Prosperity. Was fortunate to get that, and just by way of background, AFP is the largest free market grassroots advocacy organization in the country. So we're not a think tank, not a political party, obviously. We're a grassroots advocacy organization that influences state, local, and federal policy by the sheer force and numbers, essentially, as a grassroots organization, which has been extremely enjoyable for the past almost 4 years now.
Now, so which 501c are you?
Yeah, great question. So we have both. We have a 501c3 Americans for Prosperity Foundation that does issue education. We do a lot of grassroots training, things that are not purely political, purely issue advocacy, but really just educating the public on the issues and how to be active. And then we have a 501c4, which is most of the side that I'm on, which is Americans for Prosperity, where we're doing a lot of direct issue advocacy for and against legislation, holding lawmakers accountable, activating voters, activating activists to make a difference at the local, state, and federal level.
And what, give us a little bit of the history. What are the roots of AFP?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, our probably most well-known backers are Charles and David Koch, who are obviously vilified by the left. They are two of the most successful entrepreneurs this country has ever seen. David Koch was actually the Libertarian candidate for vice president in 1980, but the two of them got their libertarian leanings, I guess, from their father, who did business for a long time in this country and around the world, saw what statism looked like in the Soviet Union and was repulsed by it, obviously, which is where their political leanings came from. They felt like elected politics wasn't really the way to make a difference, which I think as libertarians we all know that politics is really not the way to affect change. And so they set about to build, first think tanks like the Cato Institute, the Mercatus Center, George Mason University, but then really to bring those ideas to people and to policymakers. They felt like the grassroots was really the element that was missing that the left for a long time has had, right? With the environmental groups, the unions, the social issue groups, you name it. They're in neighborhoods, in people's garages, at county fairs, talking to people. The free market movement didn't have that for a long time.
Right.
They started a couple different iterations of an organization, and finally Americans for Prosperity in its current form started in 2004 with just 5 state chapters. One of the stories they like to tell, that our president likes to tell, is one of the first chapters was Wisconsin, and they had the wherewithal to start it on a cold January day in Wisconsin, and I think 11 people showed up, one of whom was a little-known county politician by the name of Scott Walker back in 2004. And since then, we've grown to 36 state chapters. We have well over 3 million volunteer activists and about 500 staff all across the country. And have really turned ourselves into a bit of a formidable force at the state, local, and federal level.
So now what issues do you focus on in your group?
Yeah, absolutely. So we only deal with issues of economic freedom. So we don't deal with guns or marriage or the war on drugs or foreign policy or any of that. The issues that we focus on, we really like to think that they are Big Ten issues as far as the economic issues go: taxes, spending, labor policy, education policy, energy policy, healthcare. I like to call them kitchen table issues. They affect people's pocketbooks, their day-to-day well-being. So you would think theoretically Republicans should align more. That clearly has not been the case in a lot of places, which is why our organization has to exist, right? If it was just about electing the right people, I'd be out of a job. But we're there to hold people accountable, make sure they're fighting for small government and fighting for the taxpayer every time they show up to work.
Now, how does a young man from East Greenwich really find, if you will, the bearings to become a free market person? What was your personal, I'll call it, your personal story behind moving to that side of the aisle, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my parents are actually right behind this wall. I happen to be home in Rhode Island, which is why I'm sitting here. But it a little bit comes from my parents, and a little bit comes from just my surroundings. My parents are both immigrants. Tomorrow is actually the anniversary of the day that my dad came to the United States, and so we were always raised just with an appreciation for America, the American idea, if you will. Never really political, I think, but I think that appreciation for the idea of America, and then growing up in a place like East Greenwich, we were fortunate to have good schools and that sort of thing. But then seeing the state of Rhode Island, right? Seeing what the teachers union was doing, seeing what far left politicians were doing with the high taxes and the regulations. And I've had plenty of friends who moved out of the state, seeing what big government looks like and how it was taking away from the American dream for a lot of people led me in that direction. And then my older brother got into politics before I did, went a little bit different direction in terms of foreign policy and some of the different work, but that's sort of how I started following politics more directly. Mm-hmm. But I think I kind of put that philosophical grounding towards an interest that I always had more in state and local issues where they're really affecting people on a day-to-day basis at their kitchen table, their pocketbook, their schools, their roads, their hospitals, and so on. So really a convergence of two different things that led me to believe in the American dream and small government as the avenue to get there.
One of the challenges here in Rhode Island, of course, is what's going on with the Pawtucket Red Sox. And, the crony corporatists would point to that and discuss that in terms of they would like to position it as a source of civic pride. And my argument is that what people are really proud of is dropping off their small child at a school that is well maintained and provides a quality education, knowing that the fruits of their efforts are going to result in potentially a better life for their child. That's what people are proud of. People are proud of their homes and their neighborhoods and their communities when, because the economy is good and people have an opportunity to be employed at a variety of levels, homes are well kept, not abandoned, not boarded up because of a mortgage crisis or inability of the economy to support you. That's what people are motivated before. It really, I love the dinner table analogy, because so much of politics in terms of the national conversation takes place at the national level, yet by and large, what's going to affect my life on a daily basis is what happens a half a mile from here at Smith Hill, or as we like to call it here, Halitosis Hall. All credit, of course, to Rudy Cheeks. So what are some of those issues, and what are the positions that you folks have taken? What's the issue? Is it education that motivates you on a personal level, that fires you up?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you touched on the Paw Sox issue. That's one that I think is relatively new and growing, which is encouraging for free market folks, is this concept of corporate welfare, and stadium subsidies are a really big problem. We just got done fighting a minor league baseball stadium deal in Virginia, right outside of D.C. actually. Mm-hmm. Washington National is a county down there, one of their minor league affiliates, wanted taxpayers to pony up and pay for this private business. So we fight corporate welfare, which is not something you would typically align with our side, but that's one that I think is particularly exciting.
Let me jump in there, because I think there's a certain level of intellectual dishonesty when folks ascribe to small government, liberty folks, the notion that we support corporate welfare. I can't think of a movement in this country that is more fundamentally opposed towards income redistribution on any level than the liberty movement. We seek primarily to eliminate those type of corporate subsidies because, well, of so many issues that we can spend hours on that. But we are constantly accused of and colored with the notion that we're here to support big business. We're here, and please jump in if I'm wrong, we're here to support a level playing field so that all can experience what we have come to know as the American
No, that's exactly right. And I think that it so often is confused between being pro-business versus pro-market. And I think that's where the crony capitalist confusion comes in. But what we've actually seen over, decades and decades of economic evidence is that pro-market is actually the best environment for business to thrive in. When the government starts picking winners and losers, you're not allowing consumers in the free market that has built up what we know, this wealth and prosperity. It doesn't allow that system to work, which is why it really is just a folly of government that actually it's pretty interesting. I mean, you ask voters from both sides of the aisle, and they're completely aligned in this against stadium subsidies, against corporate welfare. It's the politicians from both parties who fall victim to this because they love the ribbon cuttings, they love taking credit for all these jobs and that sort of thing, but it really isn't real economic growth. But so that's one. That's one that I'm particularly passionate about. And then I would say beyond that.
Well, let me just jump in. I'm going to run one of my mantras by you, and feel free to critique or to rip it apart. Or one of my core beliefs is that true free market capitalism is the mechanism by which individuals can really realize their full human potential.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the only way to make gain in a free market capitalist society is to improve the well-being of other people. Capitalism was the first system known to mankind where you could get rich by benefiting other people rather than taking from other people, which is why we've seen it create obviously the wealth that we know in the United States, and currently today the principles of capitalism, free markets, the rule of law, property rights continue to lift literally billions of people up out of poverty around the world. And so I think we in the United States need to get back to those principles as they continue to spread around the world, which is very encouraging.
Right. In your parents' case, your parents and myself are of a similar generation. I would imagine, and I don't want to project into your personal life, but I would imagine what motivated to come to the United States was the notion that through hard work, perseverance, and a little bit of personal genius and a lot more hard work, their potential was virtually unlimited.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that goes right back to what America was founded on, right? Where it was the first country that, that this idea of self-determination was really essentially born here and fostered here, and that's what's made things like that possible. And I think we're slowly getting away from that, which is very disappointing, but little by little, each of these issues, right, whether it's taxes or corporate welfare or labor policy or education policy or regulations, each of them has an element to play in fostering an economy in a country where people can continue to do that. Right.
And so, interestingly enough, as other nations, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Far East, as they've recognized this incredible brain drain that has taken place, market forces begin, in many cases, to take over and introduce the conditions from that people in past generations fled to, are now looking back to their economies and saying, okay, we can reproduce this here. And what we run the risk of in America is by discouraging immigration across all boundaries without respect to the nature of it, and without encouraging the innovation economy that brought us the greatest pharmacy business in the world, the greatest software industry in the world. By eliminating those advantages, we really run the risk of losing that incredible pool of talent essentially back to their home countries.
Yeah, and I think you actually don't even need to look at other countries. This is actually happening here before our eyes as far as you look at policy. I think the states are a great example. So in my work, I oversee all of our state policy advocacy at American Prosperity, and people are leaving Rhode Island, New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut in droves, and where are they going? They're going to North Carolina, Florida, Texas, Arizona, states that are fostering an environment of low regulation, low taxes, reasonable levels of government spending, free labor environments, school choice. They're leaving states that have billions of dollars in unfunded pension liabilities, the highest taxes in the country, high property taxes, corporate taxes, regulatory environments. They're leaving, they're voting with their feet, whether or not they know it, whether or not they're partisan people, they're really ideological. They're going with where the jobs are, they're going where the opportunity is, and that's in states that are doing a better job of embracing free markets.
We, here in Rhode Island, we are run currently by a governor who's obsessed with crony corporatism, giving out grants to out-of-state companies under the notion that somehow this will interject growth into the economy. But as you look, because you have a nationwide perspective, does that type of short-term picking winners and losers, or actually looters, picking winners and looters, actually really breed the type of long-term economic growth that we so desperately crave?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think she's got exactly the wrong idea. If her ideas were working, Rhode Island would be in a lot better shape than it is. Just yesterday or 2 days ago, I saw some folks were celebrating that Rhode Island moved up to 45th best states to do business in the CNBC rankings. And granted, a lot of this has happened since long before Governor Raimondo came into office, but her approach to turning the ship around is simply floundering. It's not working because, as you said, what ends up happening is, first, when you give out corporate welfare like that, you're not actually creating organic economic growth. They're just redistributing it from where it would be growing organically. So it isn't really new economic growth, for one thing. The second thing I would say is that that's all tax revenue that the state is either losing out on, not bringing in, which is driving up taxes on everybody else, driving up taxes on individuals, driving up taxes on small businesses, job creators, innovators, et cetera. And quite frankly, I think you can see, not that Florida, North Carolina, and Texas aren't giving out corporate welfare, but the main thing that's driving companies there isn't corporate welfare. It's low taxes, it's their right to work status, where we've seen Rhode Island is overrun by government unions, private sector unions, et cetera. It's just not an attractive place to do business. No amount of corporate welfare is going to get over the fact that Rhode Island is not an attractive place to do business. And I think the implicit admission in giving out these tax credits or subsidies or tax havens or whatever, is that low taxes foster an environment of economic growth. So Gina Raimondo is selecting which companies she thinks deserve that. We think all companies deserve that, which is why we need to rein in government spending, rein in the power of unions, and really make an environment where all businesses can thrive rather than just the ones that Governor Raimondo feels like deserve to thrive here.
Right, and very often at the expense of native Rhode Island businesses. Go Local Prague really broke a story about a month or two ago that Vistaprint, a national corporation, was being attracted here by, again, a few $1 million. By the way, no real long-term generational attachment to the state. As is typical in these arrangements, it's based on job growth, and job growth is not a good organic measure of a business's success. It is a happy side effect, but businesses are ultimately driven by product development and their markets, which may or may not translate into jobs. So when you artificially create an environment which requires jobs to get the breaks, you actually are potentially, in the case of 38 Studios, crippling the company. So you have this company with a stunning admission that they weren't aware that competitors to Vistaprint actually already existed here in Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's amazing, and you brought up 38 Studios. I'm going to go to conferences all over the country and meet with think tank folks and others who are talking about corporate welfare. And I was amazed that these examples happen all over the place. That is the worst one that any of these people have ever seen is 38 Studios that happened right here under our noses in Rhode Island. And
Number
yet,
one with a bullet.
and yet Governor Raimondo and the Democrats in the legislature continue to fall for this, thinking that's the way that we're going to foster economic growth. And I think, not to impugn their motives, but it almost makes me wonder that, are you really trying to change the environment here in Rhode Island, or are you trying to get a short-term win where you can go and be there for the ribbon cutting for one company that says it's going to bring 200 jobs? It really just clearly is not working. It's time for a different direction here in the state.
Well, if there was ever a case of governmental perjury, it's the PR machine that continues to propagate the myth that Governor Raimondo is actually providing a fertile field for economic growth in the state. Around the country, journalists are spoon-fed this pablum that somehow it's working here, we're making improvements. And if there's any economic growth here in this state, I think it's fair to say it's despite the best efforts of local government.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And like I said, it's not even a political issue, right? People are voting with their feet. They're moving literally by the thousands away from Rhode Island and states like Rhode Island to places that are doing the exact opposite thing as Rhode Island, right? North Carolina is a state that I just brought up. From 2013 through 2016, they cut taxes by $4.7 billion. Over that time, created 300,000 jobs. And then just a couple weeks ago, passed a budget that cuts another $3.5 billion in taxes. Every year that they've done that, they've passed a bill to roll back regulations in the state. They're a right-to-work state, obviously. They're expanding school choice, and so they're rolling back the influence of government on their economy while Governor Raimondo continues to grow it. It's simply not the right path, and I think that at some point things are just going to get bad enough here that you elect a game changer. I think Illinois is probably a good example. They elected somebody like Bruce Rauner, right? I think it's time for somebody like a Bruce Rauner here in Rhode Island who's really going to shake things up and take power back from government and from special interests and give it back to people.
At the end of clearly one of my favorite books, one of the primary characters is seen flying over New York City as the lights begin to twinkle out. I think you know what book I'm talking about. Early on in my quote-unquote activist career in the state, I routinely promoted the notion that ultimately bankruptcy and a complete abysmal failure of the state would in fact be the only moment that could possibly generate a rebirth. I've downplayed that in the last few years to the delight of some of my critics and some of the folks who reviewed my efforts. For the record, I still believe it. I just don't say it as much. There's a disturbing trend now in several states. Despite the what would seem to be I'll call it the validation of failure in New Jersey a few years ago to implement these millionaire taxes. Is it just me, or do state governments intentionally ignore lessons learned from other state governments, or B, a failure to understand that folks who are wealthy have choices? What do you see this movement spreading nationwide? I know it's being discussed in places like Connecticut, Massachusetts. Where Connecticut, the impact was almost instant, instantly disastrous. One could say that it wasn't the root cause of General Electric leaving, but it certainly gave them the public ground cover to do so. Are other states, or is it just the wacky Northeast?
No,
that's
it's,
looking
I
at
mean,
this?
and I think that it's probably almost, been happening for years. I think one of the byproducts actually is how obviously polarizing the president is. And so what you're seeing is blue states moving way further to the left than they probably otherwise would have. And then obviously conservative free market states being a little bit more aggressive on that front. But you're seeing states like Washington, California, Oregon, Rhode Island, Connecticut really, really, throwing caution to the wind with things like millionaire taxes and, really any tax they can get through their legislature, raising it on folks and issues across the board pulling themselves towards the left. I think, you brought up New Jersey. There was, when they enacted some of these taxes, there was a particularly wealthy person in the state who moved to Florida, which obviously has no income tax, and that one person himself moving actually made a dent on the state's budget to then cope with, which is fairly amusing. But I think it just goes back to what I was saying before. It's not to say that they don't think it's a good policy or bad policy, but it goes back to, at the end of the day, these big government left-wing politicians, they're satiating the demands of special interests who are calling the shots for them. A lot of the time it's government unions, a lot of the time it's crony capitalists, what have you, but they have no desire to get government spending in check, which is why they'll never have the ability to bring government's taxes in check.
Right. And let's not forget, this may have been a little bit before your time, but the late Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, if you will, of the Kennedy clan, in her declining years, moved from Massachusetts to Florida.
I'm sure we all know plenty of people who've made that same move.
Yeah, but what's always been fascinating to me is that folks who advocate for big taxes, and let's use the Paw Sox as an example, there are people openly advocating for the use of public monies to subsidize a private corporation, which, of course, is an abomination. But in doing so, many of these folks would self-identify as being Democratic. Now, my progressive friends, and I have many, are up in arms, as are the libertarian folk here in the state about it. But many of the, quote, mainstream Democrats, because of the institutionalization, if you will, of quasi-government jobs as a golden parachute for a brief or potentially failed career in politics, they see this as their holy grail.
Yeah.
Going to work for organizations that are quasi in nature, redevelopment authorities, perfect example, who then turn around and make a lot of money helping municipalities. We've got an organization here in Rhode Island called Grow Smart Rhode Island. Now, what's fascinating, you're familiar with them. Scott Wolf is a former state legislator, I believe, and has created this burgeoning little enterprise where they talk about urban sprawl and suburban sprawl and lifestyle issues. And they run a wonderful little convention every year where everybody gets together and talks about this. But I'm not sure, on a practical level, what it really accomplishes. Yet a tremendous amount of money is following this organization. My last reading, don't hold me to these exact numbers, but my last reading was their budget was somewhere in the $500,000 to $600,000 range, for which Mr. Wolf was compensated. And these are all public records, by the way, somewhere to the tune, again, of $140,000 to $160,000 a year.
Well, I would actually, unfortunately, maybe I'll disagree with you a little bit there, which is that groups like that in a state like Rhode Island actually have a lot of influence on state lawmakers and people who are actually calling the shots, which I think touches on two different things, right? Which is that they all, at the end of the day, what are they? They're central planners, right? Whether it's through nonprofits influencing government, or it's just people in government, or it's lobbyists influencing government, they're using government to dictate people's choices, essentially, right? So a group like Smart Growth or Grow Smart Rhode Island, they want to change the decisions people make about how they get from point A to point B, whether that's by car, where they live, what they buy, how they keep the lights on in their home, whatever it is. Which one is just not the proper use of government. They unfortunately are relatively influential in the state. And I think the second point that you were touching on is this concept of government jobs, right? Which is basically to say that the point of government spending money isn't just to build roads and fix our infrastructure. It's to quote unquote create jobs, right? Which is an amusing analogy. I think Milton Friedman was probably the first one to use this, but if you could dig a hole with a backhoe employing one person, if the goal was to create jobs, why not use spoons, right? And employ 1,000 people. They clearly are not that worried about efficiency here and an efficient use of taxpayer dollars, but that seems to be a pervasive mentality in the state of Rhode Island and elsewhere that's going down this road. And it really is just the wrong direction for taxpayers, wrong direction for efficiency, wrong direction for the well-being of individuals in the state as a whole.
Well, I mean, just look out the window here at the Local Live Broadcasting Center on scenic Weybosset Street, and this rubble, this bombed-out crater-like moonscape, has been here for quite a while, despite millions being spent here in the neighborhood. Yet we look right across the street, and despite the failure, and again, I'm not ever going to tie educational performance of the school system into money, but the failure of the school systems to provide basic services in many of the urban areas in the state, which is being blamed on money, yet right across the street is a building owned by Joe Paolino, which is the next recipient of a government subsidized loan that somehow we magically found the money for. My favorite example of the GrowSmart scenario is, and my libertarian friends and close allies go insane when I talk about bus passes, but it's my weakness. I'm wrong, all right? I'll admit it. But an astonishingly small amount of money to give bus passes to people who are terminally ill, I realize that's the wrong approach, it's theft, would require nothing in the grand scheme of things. And the humanitarian in me, who is constantly trying to find a way to bridge the gap between, I'll call it libertarian paradise, and the current mess we inhabit, finds it astonishing that the money can't be found by that. And by the way, Mr. Wolf's aide actually testified in favor of closing that program, by the way, in front of the RIPTA board. I have the documentation. Yet we can somehow find, as I look out across the moonscape here, millions of dollars to loan for the politically affluent and connected.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, and I think that I think one of the things you're touching on is libertarians. Everybody wants this libertarian dream, essentially, where the government is doing almost next to nothing or nothing, depending on how far how far upstream you are. But I think the whole movement really has. We've essentially agreed that government is going to do certain things, right? It's going to provide for public schools and build roads, and whether you like it or not, they're going to do these things. Mm-hmm. They might as well focus on doing those things well for the cheapest possible cost, and I think that's where a battle needs to be taking place, which is that take as little money as you possibly ever would need to provide for the general welfare. And stop giving it to private corporations. Stop handing it out to government unions. Stop giving it to your political allies or whoever it might be. Mm-hmm. And generally, that's how I think we're going to make government smaller and more efficient and more affordable.
It's interesting because you bring up a great point of conversation, and this is something we could spend hours with. But to just spend a minute or two on, I've come full circle. I guess you could probably call me a minarchist, which is the best describe. I'm not an anarchist. Going in that direction as I get older. But as a minarchist, I believe in as little government as possible for some very, very basic functions. I know my good friend Arvind Vora routinely uses terms like state-sponsored theft for school systems. Given what an abject failure they are here on so many levels in Rhode Island, with a few notable exceptions, I wonder if, in fact, the incremental approach isn't going to lend ourselves to this continued entrenchment. I don't have a good answer for that. The best example that I've seen used to oppose the level of incrementalism by my good friend Mike Rinaldi, we often talk about the war on drugs and the legalization of cannabis. And more than a few people have pointed out that on one level, the legalization of medical cannabis was a positive step forward in ending the war on the drugs. Yet somehow by doing so, we've actually created a vested interest in legalized medical cannabis that now fights for maintaining the status quo. And so as we migrate, and this is going to come into our next area of discussion, which is educational policy, as we migrate into an area where you've got charter schools, mayoral academies, every sort of combination, permutation of school in general, do we then create, by establishing this educational firmament that's somewhere in the middle ground, tax finance, yet at the same time more independent, better, but not quite there, do we lose the bigger battle, which is to a true free market libertarian environment, or do you feel that this type of incrementalism is the only practical way to go forward?
I absolutely think it's the only practical way to go forward. I think you can sit at libertarian conferences all you want and talk about the war on drugs or anarchism or whatever idea you want to, and meanwhile the left is out here talking to people, talking to voters, getting people elected who are going to grow government and actually actively growing government while we're sitting at libertarian conferences talking about ideas, which is why what I actually like what we do at Americans for Prosperity is focus on very immediate goals, whether they're stopping bad things or passing good things, whether it's cutting taxes, expanding school choice, stopping the growth of government. There are way too many immediate fights that need to be had that either stop progress away from where we want to go or make incremental progress towards where we want to go. Because the world simply is not where libertarians would like it to be, and the way we get there isn't going to be in some giant leap talking about some abstract concept. It's going to be changing hearts and minds, and I think what really emphasizes this is, this conversation happened a few years back about the libertarian moment when it was Ron Paul and then Rand Paul, and then it obviously sort of came and went when you had two major candidates last year who believe in their own different versions of big government to some extent. It kind of came and went because I don't think the movement really grasped what an opportunity they had when people were starting to believe in the concepts, because it didn't really apply itself to day-to-day concerns, right? Day-to-day concerns of people who want to work, who want to put food on the table, who want a good education for their kids. I think focusing on things like that, and you mentioned educational choice, right? We have a government-funded school system. Let's take that money and instead of putting it in control of bureaucrats and school administrators, put parents in control of that money and let them decide what to do with it and how to educate their kids best. Let there be public schools. It might be great for some students, but you should have the freedom to not send your kids to those schools if you don't want to. I think things like that are incremental gains that get us towards a more free and open society.
So what in terms of actual recommendations, whether it be at the state level, and I guess this gets into the mechanics of AOP, do you actually go to the state level and work on legislation in conjunction with elected legislators?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 36 state chapters. We actually have state directors and field directors on the ground in those states. The state director sort of leads the chapter. Our field directors are, it's kind of an ugly term now, but they're essentially community organizers, right? Where they're organizing volunteers or organizing activists. Because, obviously, this as a libertarian, so much of big government is concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. Our model is essentially to take those dispersed costs, the taxpayers who are bearing the brunt of policy, and make them powerful enough to overcome all the lobbyists and so on. So basically what we do, and I travel around and do this with our state teams all the time, is work with lawmakers, talk to them about the issues, talk to them about why free market policy and small government policy is good, why big government policy is bad. We'll advocate for certain pieces of legislation. We'll activate volunteers to make phone calls, knock doors. We'll run radio ads, television ads. We'll send out mail pieces, you name it. It really is grassroots politicking to stop bad legislation and pass good legislation in its immediacy, all the while with this goal in mind of creating a more free and open society.
Now, you work for the C4.
Yes, I do a little bit on both sides, but mostly focused on the C4.
Okay, and so our C4s, if you could educate the listening audience a little bit, are C4s able to endorse candidates and support individual candidates' efforts?
So we almost never do. On a very, very limited basis, we'll engage and express advocacy, but we'll only generally do so against candidates. And the reason for this, 501c3s are like churches, hospitals, etc., that do essentially no issue advocacy. 501c4s have a little bit more leeway to engage for and against pieces of legislation and do more direct issue advocacy. Our organization very, very seldomly will weigh in against certain candidates so that we're never tied to a candidate, right? Because everybody comes in and makes bad decisions. We just want to make sure people that we believe are bad for the electorate in that particular area don't get the chance to put their ideas into action. But most of the time what we're doing is holding lawmakers accountable of both parties, saying, call Senator so-and-so and tell them to support this idea or vote against this bill, or, call and say thank you for doing the right thing. Is generally what our accountability looks like.
And so what are some of the big issues that you're looking to forward as we approach the next election cycle, which for most states is 2018?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned, keeping taxes low, keeping spending in control, worker freedom, labor freedom, passing right to work laws, things like that, school choice. But there are other ones that are, I think, outside that wheelhouse. And one I think that you were touching on the previous segment a little bit is as it relates to nonprofits and just the general freedom of speech. One of the things that we pride ourselves on, and organizations that agree with us and disagree with us also do this, is that organizations like ours do not have to disclose the names of their supporters to the government, and that's something that's coming under attack. Almost, obviously, our own Senator Sheldon Whitehouse is making a name for himself, going after people who challenge the government status quo, wanting to expose and intimidate them. Republicans are just as bad about this. So protecting free speech, protecting free speech and donor privacy is a particularly important issue to us, along with all the other issues of economic freedom.
Yeah, we're going to be, in the coming weeks, we're going to be having an organization called FIRE come on from Philadelphia.
Great.
Yeah, and if corporate cronyism isn't my number one issue, free speech is the second one. I have to remind my conservative friends sometimes and I love them to death, that there is a great worldwide areas of expertise and question and challenge beyond the Second Amendment. There's the First, the Fourth, you know. Sometimes I have to remind them of that, and I say that with love, by the way. No, campus free speech is an issue, and certainly the notion that folks can engage in political activity without the government navel gazing,
Sure.
without the government without the feeling that you have to expose your entire life to the government, I think is critical for the continuation of free political discourse.
Yeah, and it literally goes back to the founding of our country. Literally,
Right.
our founding fathers anonymously wrote pieces of what were essentially
Pamphlets,
issue
yeah.
advocacy. They were essentially issue advocacy, exactly what groups like ours do today, anonymously, so as not to expose themselves. And then the reason that this protection exists today is a Supreme Court case called NAACP, Alabama versus NAACP, where the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the NAACP could keep private the names, addresses, and contact information, etc., of its supporters because it would have subjected them to harassment, intimidation, even physical violence. And we've obviously seen that happening all over the country in recent years to people who believe certain things or stand for certain things. And so protecting that, I think, is something that is near and dear to us. Sheldon Whitehouse has just been an absolute disgrace on this issue, going to the Senate floor, probably weekly at this point, if not more often than that, railing against, people who fund certain causes or groups that do certain things, while never bringing those same charges against groups that support him or support the things that he believes in. It really is the height of hypocrisy. It's embarrassing. It's an attack on the First Amendment. And I think most of all, sitting here in Rhode Island, it's not an issue that Rhode Islanders care about at all. So it really is just a failure of leadership on his part and something that we're going to fight back against at the state, local, and federal level.
The big takeaway question for tonight. There are folks that, particularly in the wake of the July 4th holiday, who actually, astonishingly enough, look at the July 4th holiday for what its real purpose is, which is a celebration of our nation's independence, who would argue that in many cases, our government is acting in a role similar to that of King George in just a few hundred years ago, that our government has essentially become a placeholder for that which the English crown tried to perpetrate on us as a run-up to the revolution. How do you feel about a statement like that?
Well, I mean, I think it's all relative, right? The challenges that we face in this country are miles and miles and miles ahead of challenges that folks in other countries are facing, right? They're miles ahead of what the founders faced 241 years ago. But that being said, there are assaults on our freedoms happening every day at the local, state, and federal level. And I think the question isn't how you couch it, how bad is it, or whatever. It's what are you going to do about it, right? Mm-hmm. That's why Americans for Prosperity exists. We have activists across all 50 states, thousands of them here in Rhode Island even, while we don't have a chapter here. Folks who are willing to volunteer their time to make phone calls, to knock doors, to attend rallies. We talked about the issues in East Greenwich, right? I mean, we may not be able to change what's happening at the statewide level here, but get involved in your local government, attend a town council meeting. I mean, it's been awesome to see our local lawmakers in East Greenwich stand up for taxpayers against the government unions. For all the people who don't show up to the town council meetings, who aren't the paid union protesters, that's who they're fighting for. But it really, at some level, it's going to take taxpayers and sort of average folks getting involved, fighting back, holding lawmakers accountable. And that's probably, I would say, the most important part of the answer to that question.
Partisan politics and this sort of, I call it Hillary derangement syndrome, versus the old Bush derangement syndrome versus the Trump derangement syndrome. Is it possible? I mean, you're intimately involved on a day-to-day basis with people who are hyper politically active. The people who are able to move past these cult of personalities are able to accomplish great things at the local, at the state level. How much of a logjam is this? He did it, so she did it, so he could do it. How much of a logjam is that causing in moving us forward?
Oh, a ton. I mean, I think Washington is obviously the worst culprit of that. where everything is about just not only media headlines next day, but the next election, right? Everything counts on the next election 2 years from now. Is it going to be a Republican wave or a Democrat wave? And unfortunately, it's stopping the party that's supposed to stand for small government from actually passing things because they're afraid of losing seats. But it's sort of a weird analogy, but when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, they got Obamacare passed. Their fundamental transformation of this country, they lost 63 seats in the House. They were willing to lose their jobs to pass government-run health care. Are Republicans willing to put it all on the line to roll it back? Apparently, far too many of them are not. So it is a logjam, but I think we're seeing it less so at the state level, which is why we're seeing so many great constructive gains for small government from free market governors across the country, free market state legislatures. But I think part of that goes back to what I was saying, which is that it's a lot easier to influence lawmakers at the state and local level,
Right.
and so taxpayers have a much louder voice. And all we can do is to continue to beat the drum at the federal level and hope we get there as well.
Right. I mean, I believe with a failed responsibility, is, amongst many areas, is that in both cases, both major political parties have replaced reasoned opposition with, I'll call it a substantial idea bank, for lack of a better term, substantial solutions in place for just opposition for the sake of opposition. To me, and one of the reasons I'm a libertarian, because we do have a philosophy and a core set of beliefs that we adhere to very strongly, that one of the great failures of the Republican Party was in the, and I'm not here to Republican bash because the Democrats are equally guilty, but the Republican Party, in the 6 years that they had to prepare for the next political cycle, failed to come together with a cogent replacement for Obamacare. And even if that meant repeal and the institution of free market reforms, that simply didn't exist. There's astonishingly, despite the potentially tens of thousands of man hours spent, we still have no cogent, effective replacement for our tax code.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it is, as you mentioned, disappointing. For 7 years, they ran on Obamacare repeal, on reforming the tax code, and doing all these things, and they're doing a little bit, right, in terms of fixing the VA or rolling back regulation, but these two big ticket items, the fact that they didn't have a roadmap laid out that was truly constructive is disappointing. But I think part of the other thing is that this, the two sides just banging heads against one another has made Republicans afraid to really stand up for free market policy too often at the time. There's a group of them there, the Freedom Caucus, and some of the more strongly free market folks down there who are standing up for these values. What we would love to do is continue to bring this state-based model where you look at somebody like a Scott Walker, right, in a blue state that before last year hadn't gone Republican for president since President Reagan, continued to get elected, recalled, won the recall, got reelected, has grown these huge free market majorities in this state, and has never once backed down to the left-wing special interests. He ran on doing, big changes, did those changes, and was rewarded by voters who don't typically probably vote for Republicans, right? But he, took on the unions, he cut taxes, he stood up for the Constitution, was rewarded for it, and we would love to see that kind of courage in Washington.
Yeah, I think we all would. How can folks get involved in your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are online at americansforprosperity.org. You can sign up on our email list, sign up to be activated with us, help us make phone calls, knock doors. You can stay updated on what we're doing on Facebook at facebook.com/fightback, and we're also very active on Twitter at AFPHQ.
Excellent. And folks can contribute as well on the sites if they choose to. So you don't have a state party. Any plans to put in place a state organization here?
I don't know about Rhode Island in the very near future. I would obviously love to see one. Our closest chapter is up in New Hampshire. Obviously, the Free State Project has been a part of the libertarian movement. They make up the brunt of our activists, I believe, up in New Hampshire. But hopefully things will start spreading down this way soon.
There's Libertarian state party representatives now in the the New Hampshire legislature. Astonishing stuff when you think about it. We came awfully close. We ran 3 candidates for the General Assembly last year. All ran honest, hardcore, fact issues-based campaigns. None of the outrage porn, as I like to call it. None of the madness. Billy Hunt actually got about 39% of the vote on a one-on-one with an established party-endorsed Democrat who was backed by Speaker Mattiello. Annalee Barretto had the best performance in a 3-way race nationally as a libertarian anywhere. So yet, even in a place that seems to be in an economic death spiral, there are, what do they call them, the green shoots. You start to see in this wave of economic devastation and decimation, you start to see a wave of hope, because folks now, I believe, out of sheer desperation, are open to ideas that maybe 5, 10 years ago would have been anathema to them. There's hope out here, even in New England. So, we need organizations like this to kind of parachute troops into the because if you can somehow turn this part of the country into an entrepreneurial, capitalistic hotbed, you could do it anywhere. And I always point out in Massachusetts, I work in Massachusetts, because like many here in Rhode Island, I travel north every day with my few tired belongings to do the work that people in Massachusetts won't do. I find that in Boston, you'll find very little conversation about the minimum wage, any of the controversies surrounding $15 an hour. And there's a very simple reason for that. If you have any job which requires any real skill level, you simply can't hire people for less than $15 an hour because, let's be blunt, the economy is so white hot up there. And success does beget success, and General Electric is moving a couple of thousand jobs up there, which, unlike, say, the type of jobs that Gina Raimondo is contemplating, actually in many cases involves 7-figure salaries. If you want to talk about an example of breaking glass and adding economy, that's clearly it. And what's astonishing is the type of money that they spent, and I oppose all corporate cronyism, I oppose all corporate welfare at any time. But let's separate myself from that for a moment. The type of money they spent to get GE in is roughly that which they spent to get 38 studios here. Think about that for a moment.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane, and I think people always, you compare something like Massachusetts, you say, oh, it's a Democrat-run state, it has high taxes, it has this. Places have different ways of making themselves economically competitive. Massachusetts is an education hub, it's a business hub. Boston is a huge city. Rhode Island doesn't have those advantages, and it refuses to make the other reforms that it has to make itself competitive, like lowering taxes, lowering regulations, getting government in check. And it's because of politicians like Gina Raimondo and the big government hacks that are in the state legislature up here. And it's going to stay that way until folks start to hold them accountable.
And here's the frustration. In a very real sense, where we're sitting right here now at the Go Local Live Broadcasting Center, here at 90 Way Boston Street, right off of Dorrance Street, within walking distance are, for their respective fields and environments, 3 of the finest universities in the nation. Rhode Island School of Design, when it comes to art and design, is literally without parallel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brown University, as much as we like to tease the politically correct young of the Brown University undergrad, the Brown University Graduate School is one of a handful of finest universities in the world in areas like computer science. Immediately behind us, is Johnson & Wales. Arguably one of the finest culinary and hospitality schools in the world, and have managed to, from this hub here in Providence, managed to expand on a worldwide level. So when you couple that with our geographic advantages being literally a heartbeat away from Boston and New York City, and not terribly far away from DC, when you couple the low cost of real estate here relative to the boom towns that we're surrounded by, when you look at just the type of people who live here and their historic contributions to the nation in terms of manufacturing, in terms of engineering, when you include all of that, one has to look at where we are right now and really be heartbroken. Because it simply doesn't have to be this way, does it?
No, it does not. It is heartbreaking, but I think people see heartbreak in rankings and tax rates and this and that. What's heartbreaking is people having to leave the state. It's young people who can't find opportunity here. There's real human cost to the bad big government policies we're seeing. But I think, it's hard, but I think a dose of optimism is always good to go into the weekend on. But there are obviously people fighting back, whether it's a libertarian movement or some of the good folks in the legislature, or it's the Center for Freedom and Prosperity here in Stenhouse's group, where it can only get so much worse before people are fed up and start saying to turn the ship around.
And to that, I had the opportunity to meet your parents during our brief break. Wonderful people, clearly very proud of their children who have accomplished great things even in their young lives. I sense that they would love to have you accomplish those things here in Rhode Island or Boston.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think obviously my field's a little bit different, having been in politics, but I mean, my parents aren't alone, right? I mentioned that I have countless friends who have left the state and gone to New York, gone to Boston, wherever.
Same
I'm sure
here.
their parents would have loved to have them stay, and now it's to the point where their parents are even moving out of the state because there's no point in paying the property tax rates, the individual income tax rates, and dealing with what they're dealing with here in Rhode Island. So hopefully it will only be a matter of time until we can get rid of the good politicians, get rid of the bad politicians, put in some good ones, and start turning the state around.
Well, Akash Chagoli, did I pronounce that correctly?
Chogli.
Chogli, I'm sorry. Americans for Prosperity. You're the policy director. You're a proud son of Rhode Island, the East Greenwich School System, Boston College, a proud son of New England. You've gone elsewhere to take the fight, but I have a sense that this won't be the last time you'll be here bringing the fight back home.
I'll be back soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us on short notice, spending an hour with us away from your family. But again, they must be very, very proud of you.